The Untold Stories of Bonita Springs is being made possible in part by the City of Bonita Springs, Lee County Board of County Commissioners, Robert and Kay Gow through the Bonita Springs Community Foundation, and James Harper Marshall through the Bonita Springs Community Foundation.
Florida, long the land of the adventurer, the fortune seeker, the aged, and the infirmed, burst into the light of the sun about 15,000 years ago. Aborigine people were said to worship the sun, to whom they attributed the good fortune of all their victories and longevity. In the 1500s, the Spanish conquistadors sought riches in gold and silver. France, England, and Spain fought for years over control of the land of the sun. The young United States purchased the tropical peninsula from Spain in 1821 at a bargain price, and American settlers quickly became land speculators. In the 1880s, railroads laid the tracks connecting land-rich Florida to the outside world. The wealthy, the curious, the tourists, the settlers, and the dreamers all discovered the warmth and the beauty of our tropical paradise. Fishing, farming, cattle, and citrus became the mainstays of the growing economy. The automobile and the jet engine made Florida a winter destination or for life. Today, the state bustles with growth and prosperity. The Sunshine State is home to millions who enjoy an unsurpassed quality of life. Florida is fulfilling its destiny from the time the embryonic land saw the first light of the sun. The 21st century remains the unconquered challenge.
Hello and welcome to Southwest Florida History, The Untold Story. Join me, Matt Johnson, as we experience the people, places, and events that tell the untold story of our Southwest Florida community, Bonita Springs. The town of Bonita was not always the leisurely waterfront community we all know today. Bonita Springs' humble beginnings began along the banks and coastlines of this waterway, known as the Imperial River.
Our story of Bonita Springs begins in the 1870s with a record of a land described as swampland and land subject to overflow. Entrepreneur Hamilton Diston from Pennsylvania bought 6 million acres of South Florida swampland for 25 cents an acre. Diston then drained the swamps, dug canals, and surveyed the land.
The town of Survey was a spot on the river where the engineer surveyors, and they surveyed the whole area, and it was like a Wild West town, according to my father. Everybody of any value, they carried a big knife and they carried a gun, and it was part of the survival of the wild country. You needed these things to protect yourself.
Over the next decade, only a handful of people called Survey home. But that began to change in 1884 when two men from Alabama, Archibald McLeod and Braxton Bragg Comer, along with some friends, purchased thousands of acres of land. Comer bought out the other investors and recruited approximately 50 African-American families from Alabama to plant and work in his coconut and banana groves. He also cultivated pineapples from plants he imported from Cuba. The cold winter of 1893 to 94 destroyed Comer's fields, and he sold the land to W.C. Batty, a real estate man from Fort Myers, who planted the area's first citrus groves. The groves brought in new settlers. Before long, a school was needed. The community's first school was set up in a storefront. The Walker, Whidden, Lyles, and Coker children attended. Although agriculture was the mainstay of the local economy, fishing also provided an income.
A lot of the early people that were here, of course, came here for the fishing industry, and so they could raise their families down here, and they lived on the old boats that they called lighters back then. And they would tow these boats to an area and tie them up, and then they would fish from them. If they were down here, they would build little homes. The fishing that was done here was mostly mullet. The mullet has always been the main staple of the fishermen in this whole area here. Fishing back then, it was just basically the way it is now. It was some good time, good years, and sometimes there were some pretty lean years, you know. And
didn't make much money back then, our parents. I can remember when my father bought the biggest part of that fish camp, and he gave $1,000 for it. I worked for 3 years for nothing to help him make the payments on it. But we survived. If it didn't eat us, we eat it. And we lived off the land, and we made our living off the land.
The Imperial River played a vital role in the community.
As a child, I would go up the Imperial River and back, and you know, we remember a lot of the main places that were built down in Bonita were built close to the river. Then they kind of expanded out from there, but all the rivers were down here were a main highway for the early settlers.
George Randolph was one of the best-known boat captains during this era. He had a large sailing vessel named the Iris F after his sister.
I know about my father being a captain of a boat that he built and dismantled the Wayside Inn up north Fort Myers and brought it down to Bonita Springs and put it back together.
And the Wayside Inn was one of his big jobs, and it was quite a feat. I respected him for his capabilities, what he tried to do, what he did do, and remember him as a strong, honest, forthright man who tended to his own business and no one else's. That's the memory I have of my dad, my father, Captain George Randolph.
In 1912, a group of investors, including J. Henry Ragsdale and Dan Farnsworth, purchased 5,000 acres, including Survey, which they renamed Bonita Springs. There are two stories about how Survey got its new name.
Bonita Springs was the name of the town, but it was named after the springs that would flow thousands and thousands of gallons a day into the creek.
It was changed to Bonita Springs by a developer who bought up large tracts of land, and they developed it, and they thought that it would be more suitable to sell the land as Bonita Springs rather than Survey.
The community continued to grow, and with the growth came the need for a public school. The first public school was a log structure with a dirt floor. By 1912, 70 students from 20 families were enrolled. In September 1921, a brick school building opened on Dean Street.
My grandfather, wonderful, wonderful man, very good to us. He owned citrus groves, and he contributed to the community by giving the first school on his property.
My grandmother, Ona Hendricks, was one of the first teachers here. She came here in 1924 from Mayfield, Kentucky. She taught school here for several years.
Early school days were quite simple. There were like 2 grades in each class. First and second were together, and the third and fourth, and fifth and sixth, and they weren't primitive, but the windows had no screens on them. The horse flies and the flies came in, and there was no air conditioning or lunch program. You brought your own brown bag, and if you misbehaved, you might get punished severely. And it wouldn't be with the back of the knuckles, it would be with a big heavy paddle on the pants, on the seat.
The 1920s also saw the construction of churches and sawmills. The lumber industry flourished.
My grandfather and grandmother came here from Bainbridge, Georgia in 1922, and my grandfather bought a sawmill in Fort Ogden, Florida, and had it transported here by truck and reestablished on Beach Road. The men would, work from daylight till dark, and we had some blacks that worked with us. There were a few black homes on the property, and that's where they lived. They would babysit us. These black men would sit and rock us and sing to us, and that was fun.
The town briefly became incorporated for the first time in the 1920s.
The place was incorporated, but nobody knew it was incorporated. Nobody paid taxes, and it went bankrupt. And I don't know, we just kind of lived the life like Tom Sawyer.
It became easier to travel in 1922 to 23 when the Fort Myers Southern Railroad Company laid tracks to Bonita Springs.
The changing from The mode of transportation from the river, well, it all transpired when they built the railroads. And then when they built the railroads, why the mail came in by railroad, and all the equipment and supplies, and the river boats were like phased out.
The Heitman Hotel, built in Grand Art Deco style, opened in 1924, and in the winter months was a popular vacation destination. A later generation knew it as the Shangri-La.
When we were children, the Shangri-La was built, and we'd walk by it. There weren't sidewalks. We'd walk by it and we would stare in and through the fence and through the gates, and we would imagine who stayed there, and we figured it would be elegant, glamorous people. We just thought that this must be the most elegant place in the world.
Construction of the Tamiami Trail in Bonita began in the 1920s. By 1928, this major highway linking Tampa to Miami cut right through the heart of Bonita Springs and changed the community forever.
Tamiami Trail was designed to move traffic from Tampa to Miami. It was a big deal. They went right through the middle, but probably today wouldn't even allow them to do it. They ruined all the wetlands, they'd say. But they went through and built it, but took years and years. People died of malaria. It was almost like digging the Panama Canal, the way it was. They had to work on it because everything was wet.
Newcomers continued to arrive. In 1925, Mr. and Mrs. Archer Baird came to Bonita Springs from Boston. They built Baird's Camp on the south side of the river. These were Prohibition days, and Baird's enterprise developed a reputation.
Baird's place was the meeting place on the weekends, mostly for entertainment Friday and Saturday night. And you see, Baird's Camp is where the tourists came and camped there, and of course they didn't always get along real well with the natives.
I was in Baird's one time. It was off limits for us, and I was quite surprised to discover later on that my father had built it because they had alcohol, I guess, or beer or something in there, and we were just never allowed to go there.
The rumors that spread about, I suppose, is why you didn't want to go near there. You were afraid that you just didn't want any part of it, and somebody might come flying out the door at you. Too much fun and too much liquor.
In contrast to Baird's rowdy honky-tonk, the serene waters of Bonita Beach provided refuge for residents and a growing number of visitors.
Bonita Springs was my happy place to be. One of the most wonderful things about it was the beach, where the wonder was the color of the water, the pelicans flying over in a straight line and diving for fish, and of course the shells. We loved the shells.
The Wayside Inn is probably the most fun place to be. The people that would come down were wonderful. Became more or less families during the 3 to 6 months that they would stay in Bonita Springs.
In the 1930s, many remarkable people came to Bonita and opened up attractions and businesses that remained for decades. Harold Krant came to Southwest Florida from Nova Scotia.
My dad used to come to Bonita Springs, or to Naples actually, fishing in the wintertime. And he decided that he didn't like to spend any more cold winters up north in Canada, and that he'd like to move to Bonita Springs and start a shell factory. And so he did. It was just a little roadside building, and he used to go down, literally go down to the beach with bushel baskets and gather shells and bring them up and sell them.
When the shell factory went in, we would go and we would marvel at all the colors and all of the shapes and kinds of shells that they had.
Mr. Krant eventually purchased surrounding land and added an orange-painted domed building. Krant was Bonita's largest employer. Brothers Lester and Bill Piper opened a refuge for injured animals, which would later come to be known as the Everglades Wonder Gardens.
When they opened it to the public in 1936, February 22nd, It was known as the Everglades Reptile Garden because the abundance of the animals that were in my grandfather's backyard were reptiles. He couldn't believe that everybody was afraid of everything that was wild in Florida. Snakes, alligators, and crocodiles. So he wanted to educate people. He was befriended by the Indians because they heard about him and my Uncle Bill being so in love with nature. My Uncle Bill and my grandfather got to know them so well, and they respected each other.
I can remember when Tom, Dick, and Harry, the three little bears that came to the Everglades Wonder Gardens, and Bill brought these three little bears in a teacup. If you can imagine how little they were in a teacup. The mother had been killed, and they saved those bears, and they named them Tom, Dick, and Harry. And it was a few years later when they discovered that Harry was a Harriet.
Piper is fondly remembered by his grandson.
Before he passed away and he was in the hospital, I was talking to him and I said, Grandfather, I said, you know, you can't die because you haven't introduced me and Buck, my brother, to everybody that you know in the world that's involved with the environment and conservation. So the best way that I could figure that people would be able to know who I was that if I put him forever on my arm, and then I wouldn't have to go to a big explanation. And so when I shook somebody's hand and squeezed it real good, they knew that he meant something to me, and then the connection would be there.
Elsewhere in the community, family-owned grocery stores like Lawhons and Benson's became meeting places for locals.
We could walk up to Lawhons, and the exciting thing there was getting an ice cream bar. I thought that was a wonderful store because the Lawhon son could wait on me, and I thought, he's just a kid and he gets to work.
Benson's Grocery was established about 1934 by Clomer and Lydia Benson, starting about 1934 or so. They opened it originally. And then during World War II, Clomer Benson went into the Navy and was in the Navy for several years. And Lydia ran it. She ran it.
World War II affected Bonita Springs economically and socially. It also hit many families close to home.
My father was drafted, and he came home for a couple of weeks, R&R, and my mother got pregnant. And as soon as the baby came, my grandmother got hold of the Red Cross, and as soon as Daddy could prove that he had 3 children, a man 36 years old with 3 children was exempt. And so we always thought my little sister Shirley was very special. She brought Daddy home.
It was very difficult for women to do anything and be given credit for it in those years. I think the Rosie the Riveters of the war years sort of opened up a whole new field for women. Women began to realize everything that women were capable of, and it made for a whole different atmosphere for women.
The world was changing, and along with it, Bonita Springs. However, even as the region grew, the sense of living in a close-knit community remained.
We did an awful lot of playing out on the street. I mean, I learned to ride my bike on US 41. And skate, we used to roller skate right down US 41.
Having my father as postmaster of Bonita Springs made, I think, life possibly a little more difficult for me because I was known by more people than I knew. It seemed like my parents were always the first parents contacted, like if a group of us boys went into somebody's orange grove. I was the one that got reported, the other boys weren't. Everybody knew my dad, but it was nice also and made you feel like you belonged to the community.
After World War II, more and more people found their way to Bonita Springs.
There were military bases all around Bonita Springs, so consequently why we had a lot of military people that changed the face of our society because these men liked it here and they came back, and some of them told their parents about it, and they came, and so it really started back during the Second World War.
We moved to Bonita Springs in 1945. Theodore Saman and I were
husband and wife. When we bought the grove, but we didn't buy half the town. That's what she said. She said, oh, those people come in and bought half the town. But that was just a remark that they said. It wasn't true. It was the first fruit stand between Fort Myers and Miami. I didn't know that. The people told me that, the ones traveling. And they told me that. It says, well, you're the first stand that we've come to. So the first day that I was opened, I had one customer, he and his wife bought a juice, 2 juices. We sell the 10-ounce cups for 10 cents a piece. And I made 20 cents that day.
Growth continued at a good pace throughout the 40s and early 50s. Then came the fateful night of December 31st, 1952.
The phone rang 1 or 2 in the morning, and I happened to be the one to answer the telephone. And you know, someone on the line, I have no idea who, said, you know, get your father, the shell factory's on fire. And I think it was something Dad had worried about a lot. And you know, so we were all just horrified that this was happening, and he and my uncle jumped in the car and, you know, drove to Bonita Springs at 120 miles an hour, I think, and got down there, and it was hopeless.
The shell factory fire was a terrible thing. Proved to Bonita how very badly we needed a fire department. The fire trucks had to come all the way from Fort Myers, which took quite a while. And the building burned down. I mean, they couldn't save anything.
The reason my dad decided to rebuild in North Fort Myers as opposed to on the same spot where it burned down was because there had been talk for years about moving 41, which they ultimately did, that, you know, he wouldn't have any business because it was mostly people on the highway traveling that stopped in, you know, to buy all the souvenirs and seashells.
Less than 10 years later, disaster struck again. Hurricane Donna roared into Bonita Springs on September 10, 1960, wreaking havoc on the community.
The winds came in and very slowly. We knew it was going to be a bad water hurricane because it was coming to us off of the Gulf. After the eye came, I made a trip down to the beach with my camera.
By the following morning, it was clear that rebuilding would take a great deal of effort, money, and many months.
Probably the winds were as high as 180 miles an hour. There was a terrible surge on our beach that just took everything off our beach. We had no power for 2 or 3 weeks. We had no power. We had no water. I had 3 babies, 1 in diapers, and this was before the days of Pampers. It was a devastating time. Just about everybody had some damage.
Despite damage from Donna, one local hotel was reborn, and the Shangri-La opened for business in 1964.
I understand that due to the tides that did come in, and the flooding was up probably to the last step of the front entrance. And then, of course, the motel areas in the back were all damaged because they were flooded out. And then we, of course, since then had built 2 new buildings that housed 18 to 20 rooms more. And we put our children on the payroll. They all punched their time card, and they all did their working at different hours after school or on the weekends. They learned absolutely the complete business from the office to the kitchen to the outside work. And for that reason, I do believe this is what my husband had always dreamed of being the 2 of us working together and having our children with us.
It took some time for the residents of Bonita Springs to recover from Donna's wrath. Unfortunately, not all the town's famous landmarks survived. But this was a time for the residents of Bonita Springs to rebuild their dreams and their community. They did just that, and in doing so, wrote another chapter of Bonita Springs history. I'm Matt Johnson. Thanks for joining me in exploring the untold stories of Southwest Florida history.
Baird's Place. Too much fun to let these stories go untold.
Brawls in Baird's Place, and they would call the sheriff's department, and they would send a deputy down, and By the time they got there, where the furniture would all be put back in place.
We decided to go in and see what they were doing. They were getting ready for a square dance, and all the tables were pushed back against the end of the wall, and they were putting cornmeal on the floor for the square dance. And when I saw someone who knew me, I thought, I better leave. I'm sure they'll tell my mother.
Never went there. Went in there one time with my dad to see him about something. That was off limits.
Well, we weren't allowed to go in a tavern. I had to leave Bonita Springs before I went to a tavern.
Never went there.
The rumors that spread about, I suppose, is why you didn't want to go near there. You were afraid that you just didn't want any part of it, and somebody might come flying out the door at you. Too much fun and too much liquor.
Never went there.
I never drank, only orange juice.
By today's standard, he had a church house, I guess.
I used to do the hoochie coochie on the bar there. I was the former Ziegfeld Follies girl for Bonita.
Seriously, did you go in there?
No, I have been in there, but no, I did not frequent that place.
Never went there.